From New York Times Opinion, I'm Lulu Garcia Navarro, and this is First Person. Researchers have noted a curious pattern in American history. After overseas wars, domestic extremism often surges. It happened after Vietnam, the Gulf War, Iraq, and today a lot of leaders of militia groups are veterans and want you to know it. It's controversial to suggest a link between military service and extremism. But after January 6th, even the Department of Defense acknowledged that it was an issue worth examining, calling the riot a wake-up call. Of the 16 Oath Keepers and Proud Boys charged with sedition after the attack on the Capitol, more than half were veterans. And January 6th is only the most well-known incident. In the last few years, veterans have been involved in bomb plots, mass shootings, and the plan to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. But are veterans actually more vulnerable to radicalization? And if so, how can it be stopped? Kris Goldsmith is a veteran, and he's thought a lot about how people who've served end up in extremist groups and what should be done about it. Today, Kris Goldsmith on veterans in the crosshairs. And we should note, Kris is married to an editor here at the New York Times, but that's not how we came to him. So before we jump in, how exactly should I describe what you do? Are you like a, thorn in the side of the Aryan nation, a professional internet lurker? What should we say?
I mean, I describe myself as a Nazi hunter.
A Nazi hunter?
Yeah. I mean, it's literally what I do.
Literally in the internet sense. Kris tracks neo-Nazi and extremist groups' activities online and writes reports he shares with law enforcement, journalists, and researchers. In some ways, you can draw a line between what he's doing now and how he started his career as a young enlisted soldier in the early days of the war in Iraq.
So I joined the Army as a forward observer. Historically, a forward observer, the best examples are like Tom Hanks' war movies. So even like Saving Private Ryan, when they're all walking through the jungle, they get ambushed by the enemy, everybody hits the ground, and then there's a nerdy guy with the glasses and a radio screaming into a microphone, and then things start blowing up. I was the nerdy guy with the glasses and the microphone. But when I got to Sadr City, because it was so densely populated, I couldn't make things go boom. So instead, they kind of made up a position for me. They made me an on-the-ground intelligence reporter.
In that job, Kris was supposed to document the brutal sectarian violence of the Civil War.
So at 19 years old, it was my job, when we found a mass grave, to take close-up photos of the faces of lifeless men whose bodies showed clear signs of torture. And we never were able to find out, for the most part, most of the victims that we found, we never found out who they were. I'm just documenting violence to write a report that'll never get used to solve any sort of murder or anything. I was documenting violence just for the sake of, some colonel being able to say, oh yeah, my unit went out and did XYZ today. No Iraqi was helped by that. No American was more safe because of that. We were just going through these motions and I was being traumatized for no good reason at all.
How did that change how you felt about the military? I mean, did it?
Yeah. So, I wanted to fight. I wanted to go get revenge for the people who were killed on 9/11. And I found myself in Iraq, which had nothing to do with 9/11. I was miserable in the Army. I didn't see any point in the mission that we were fighting in Iraq. So May of 2007 was when I was supposed to get out of the military. I started saving up my leave days so that I could put those towards the end of my contract and actually get out early. And then in January of 2007, during the State of the Union address, President George Bush announced the troop surge.
America will change our strategy to help the Iraqis carry out their campaign to put down sectarian violence and bring security to the people of Baghdad. This will require increasing American force levels.
And I knew what that meant right away. It meant that I was going to be stop-lossed, which means it doesn't matter what your contract says, you are going overseas with your unit.
It's essentially a backdoor draft. I mean, you can't actually leave your contract and you have to stay enlisted.
Yes, that's exactly what it is.
So considering how you were feeling about the military and being forced to stay in and go back to a war which you at this point felt was unjust, what happened?
So by then, I had been experiencing severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but I didn't know what post-traumatic stress disorder was or what it looked like or what the symptoms were. I was drinking extremely heavily, which was, to me, was normal. Everybody that I came home from Iraq with who lived in the barracks, who were still on base, all we did was drink extremely heavily. But I was also having nightmares, and I started having panic attacks. And I had already gone through the pre-deployment screening. The Army had already, declared me medically fit to deploy. And it didn't matter that, I eventually started seeing a psychologist on base, and telling them that I was suicidal because the Army had already checked that box about me being deployable. I was set to go. And eventually, it reached a point where on the weekend of Memorial Day 2007, I attempted suicide.
You did?
Yeah. Yep. And the Army, my unit, accused me of malingering, of making up my symptoms. So 3 months after my suicide attempt, I was kicked out of the Army with a general discharge, which cost me my GI Bill benefits. And, part of the dream was to go to college, and they took that away from me.
So you're in your early 20s. You have been discharged from the military.
Mm-hmm.
What did the future look like for you at that point? Where did you end up?
So I ended up going from Sergeant Goldsmith, that was my identity, to Kris, living in his childhood bedroom, completely unemployable, suffering severe post-traumatic stress disorder. And I'm spending a lot of time alone on YouTube, falling down, conspiracy theory rabbit holes.
When you say conspiracy theory rabbit holes, describe to me what you were looking into.
Yeah, so I was, trying to figure out, I had felt like I had been lied to about, we had all been lied to about the pretense of the war in Iraq. And so I was trying to understand how it was that America was tricked into invading Iraq after 9/11. And with, anti-war videos came conspiracy theories about things like, invading Iraq for oil, which, translated to invading Iraq for the bankers.
Iraq shows the 3 stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in.
It is important to understand that one of the most lucrative things that can happen for the bankers is war. For it forces
there were 9/11 truther videos.
Folded like a pancake.
This is high school physics.
What exactly happened on 9/11?
The official accounts of 9/11 are false. With the buildings,
And once you start watching those types of videos on YouTube, the algorithm just pumps more of that similar content into your feed. So I was watching InfoWars and Alex Jones well before he was, known for what he is today.
In this film, you will learn how our world is truly governed. You will see how highly secretive roundtable groups interlock to form a global intelligence network.
I started to see a pattern, started to feel like my entire version of reality was shaped by this mysterious, nameless global cabal.
It's time to wake up. People in power go out of their way to make sure you are perpetually misled and manipulated.
Would you describe the sentiment as anti-government?
Yeah. Yeah, it was extremely anti-government. I mean, I identified as, first as a Republican and then as a libertarian. And, shortly before my suicide attempt is when the first Republican primary debate was. And that was the first time I saw Ron Paul, then a congressman, running for office.
The former congressman from Texas who's often called the godfather of the Tea Party, who's a vocal critic of the federal government.
Yes. And he, in the Army, you see an incredible amount of waste, of just government waste, of things that don't make any sense, but you do them just because you have to, go through the motions. And Ron Paul seemed to be, to me, who at the time identified as a Republican, the only person out of a, pretty broad spectrum of candidates who was speaking truth to power.
I didn't endorse the war. I think the war is wrong. I think we went in there for the wrong reasons. There were no weapons of mass destruction. There were no Al-Qaeda there.
And Ron Paul became my personal hero as a truth teller.
Civilization advances when you have less power in government. The wonderful part about a free society, you eliminate entirely victims. There are no victims. Ideas spread. They can't stop them. An idea whose time has come cannot be stopped by any army or any government.
Not him as a person, but him as a movement became briefly my reason for living. I was still severely depressed. I was still unemployable. I was still suffering all of the worst symptoms of PTSD. And I was not thinking about the future. But I still saw myself as a patriot. So, I was going around in the middle of the night spray painting Ron Paul Revolution, in my hometown. And when Ron Paul lost, that was the first round of belief about a stolen election that I had been exposed to.
He didn't get the nomination. He didn't lose.
Yeah. And, I started to feel like the system is rigged. There was, again, a mysterious cabal that I didn't have a name for or know who was behind it, but I felt like there were people manipulating me and every other American like me.
Did you think you were at risk of being radicalized? I mean, did you understand it in those terms or worry about it at all?
No, at the time. I mean, the only radicalization, extremism that we ever talked about at that time had to do with, Islam. The Republican Party was obsessed with, trying to get Obama to say the phrase radical Islam, right? There was no discussion that I was paying attention to about domestic extremism at the time. And, when I saw people that were like-minded in terms of libertarian and the pro-Ron Paul thing, starting to form militias and arm themselves and prepare, for a fight against the government, that part never appealed to me, but it seemed rational in a way to me.
It's interesting because, Ron Paul has this very particular place in the ecosystem of the right I'm thinking about Stuart Rhodes, who is also a veteran who campaigned for Ron Paul in 2008, and he went on to found the Oath Keepers, which is the far-right anti-government paramilitary group. You were clearly in a world of beliefs that can lead to some pretty extreme places. What got you thinking about the future again and out of that headspace?
About 5 years of therapy with the VA. They really put a lot of work into pulling me back and pulling me out of this like terrible self-destructive place. And about 5 years after I got kicked out, I finally found out that I was eligible for what was called at the time vocational rehabilitation, which is a program to help disabled veterans become employable again. So I started in school, and the first semester that I was at my community college in Long Island, every step of it was difficult for me. But I eventually got enrolled in classes and started with like remedial courses and, taking the most basic courses like Economics 101 and 102 challenged my libertarian beliefs that had a lot to do with, monetary policy and economics that I did not understand at all. And I didn't understand that I didn't understand them. I was being taught to think critically. I was being taught to analyze evidence and arguments and to actually perform real research, not just, look things up on YouTube and have an algorithm push you down whatever decision you've already made. I started to learn to think, period. And I started getting interested in policy making. And I found a mentor at the school who taught me how to, work with Congress to get legislation passed, to start actually fixing problems. So I went from completely nihilistic to really believing that I still had a chance to make a difference and serve my country in a meaningful way.
That became your purpose then, from being anti-government to trying to change the government.
Exactly. So I started advocating on things like fixing the way that people get discharged from the military. Most specifically, like vets with post-traumatic stress disorder, people like me who served and got chewed up and spit out, not getting the help that they needed and deserved while in the military. And over the next few years, I was averaging getting a bill passed every single year as part of the National Defense Authorization Act to help veterans with bad paper discharges. Incremental changes, but it was the first time that I started to really see myself as able to make a positive change in a way that would affect more Americans in a positive way than anything I ever did in service.
Eventually, that work landed Kris a job at Vietnam Veterans of America, lobbying Congress on healthcare and educational policy, until one day he found himself back in the rabbit holes of the internet.
So I started to make this connection about veterans and extremism in 2017. I found a fake version of my employer's Facebook page. So Vietnam Veterans America, there was a fake version that had 500,000 followers, which was far larger than our audience. The page was only 6 months old. It was backed up by a host of websites. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a rogue member just out there doing a good thing. And it wasn't until I saw this manipulated video that it clicked and I understood what was going on. This manipulated video showed, it was a 58-second clip from rural Massachusetts, like a local news. It was a true story of a Black Vietnam vet's monument being defaced. But when I saw it on Facebook, it was being presented as if it were a live video. So it looked like a breaking important story. And This was manipulative in so many ways that all of a sudden I understood, like, there's another purpose here.
What did you understand that bigger purpose to be at that point?
So I looked up the websites, found out that they were based in Russia. It was to use our reputation as an organization and as veterans to divide people, to cause conflict, and to make my constituency in this organization feel as if they're under attack constantly. Most of America was talking about the Russia investigation and Trump, and then eventually the Mueller investigation. So we as Americans were acutely aware of things like how foreign powers, like the Russian intelligence services, had manipulated Americans on social media to radicalize them, to shift their belief systems, their value systems, to get them to fight one another. And, for these Vietnam vets who had been treated so poorly, many of them described to me being spit on, that they would throw out their uniforms at the airport when they came home from war so that they wouldn't be identified as veterans. Them seeing these repeated manipulated videos and articles about real stories about Vietnam vets' monuments being defaced, they weren't recognizing it as propaganda, and they were feeling deeply hurt. They were feeling as if they were constantly under attack by Americans who were targeting them because of their identity.
So it inflamed very real tensions that already existed. What did you come to understand about why these vets were being targeted?
So working at Vietnam Veterans America, I came to understand, I started to learn about veterans, in that we are more likely to own businesses, to do better in school than our peers, to, not just graduate with higher GPA, but actually finish school once we start it. We're more likely to be community leaders. And that doesn't just mean getting elected. It means being a soccer coach or, a Girl Scout troop leader. I recognized that we were high value targets, and that we were economically efficient targets for these foreign disinformation campaigns, because we veterans, when we believe something, when our voting behavior is changed, when our belief system is changed, when our value system is changed, we're more likely to take people along with us.
Let me understand what you're saying here. You're saying that because vets inspire respect, they have a privileged place in our society, they're more likely to shift the opinion of those around them than other groups. And that's why actors like the Russians were really trying to co-opt them.
Correct.
To move them in a direction that would be divisive.
Yep.
Kris ended up writing a 200-page report about all the different ways veterans were being targeted online, mostly focused on foreign threats. Then the pandemic hit, and he was laid off from his job at Vietnam Veterans of America. And just as he found himself with a lot more time on his hands, he got a call.
A friend of mine who I had served in the Army with, who I had, stayed close with, had called me up kind of out of the blue and says, "Hey, Goldie, I joined this neo-Nazi group called Patriot Front, and I want you to help me take them down." Now, I had never heard of Patriot Front before. I had known about militias from, the Ron Paul days and the start of the Oath Keepers. They were like a group that I kind of came out of the same circle that I did. So I knew about them. But this organization's different. He started telling me, he's like, "Yeah, man, these are actual neo-Nazis. Like, they actually love Hitler." And he started describing them as, it's a youth-focused organization that is training to become ever more militant. He basically helped me understand on that phone call that they were deliberately recruiting, radicalizing, and training young American men to become an insurgency, a racist, anti-Semitic, anti-LGBT insurgency.
So you get a call from a friend of yours who's gotten involved with a group called the Patriot Front. Your friend tells you he's infiltrated the group. What does that mean exactly?
So they were looking for radicalized young white men. So he was able to infiltrate by pretending to be one of them because he, though they didn't know who he was personally, they were looking for his type. Someone who had been in the military.
They saw him as a veteran.
Yeah, so white supremacist groups and the Russians or Fortune 500 companies all target veterans for the same reasons, because we are going to bring more value to the organization. And in the case of the white supremacists, it's not just about, combat training. It's about understanding leadership. So when they recruit veterans, they're recruiting a level of professionalism that they can't get anywhere else.
And what was your role in this scheme?
My role was to expose them, to do the documentation, to write analyses. And for months, I just, was logging onto their Patriot Front's systems and just copying everything that I could and putting it into organized folders and labeling the evidence so that I could pass it on to a reporter, and was hoping that, a law enforcement agency might do something with it.
So you first start paying attention to these groups in 2020. A lot of these groups use the idea of patriotism, defending the Constitution, as rallying cries. How were you seeing those ideas discussed in relation to the election?
So I was infiltrating multiple groups at the same time. So both these neo-Nazi groups like Patriot Front and militia groups like the 3% Security Force. And the stolen election lie before the election, or stop the steal phrase, became popular. It was something that Roger Stone had used years ago, and then it became popular with one of his disciples, Jack Posobiec, a former Navy officer who's become a far-right agitator and propagandist. The idea that the system was rigged, in the way that I used to feel like the system was rigged. Those narratives were spinning up before Trump ever started talking about a stolen election.
So those narratives are spinning up. Obviously, they get supercharged when Trump does start to talk about a stolen election. Mm-hmm. And then we get to January 6th, 2021. And it doesn't take long for it to start to emerge that there were veterans there that day playing some pretty central roles in the insurrection. Were you surprised?
It was exactly what I was afraid of. It was what happened on January 6th, and the role of veterans being involved is precisely what I thought was going to happen, because when I was infiltrating the 3% Security Force, they were talking about it. That's a militia, not exclusively veterans, but geared towards recruiting veterans and run by veterans. And they were talking about, storming the Capitol.
Kris, you're saying it wasn't a surprise to you because you'd been infiltrating these groups. For me, though, I also didn't find it surprising because, much of the general population feels that there might be an overlap between military circles and right-wing causes. What do you make of that link and connection?
So I have not seen convincing evidence that veterans are more likely to be radicalized. more likely to be susceptible to disinformation campaigns. And that may be the case, but I have not seen evidence of it. I haven't seen a peer-reviewed study of it.
So you're saying that vets are not more susceptible to the allure of extremist ideology?
I don't think so. No. I think that the same thing that like made me vulnerable to conspiracy theories and, starting to flirt with extremist ideology, it wasn't my military experience. It was my instability. It was my economic instability, my mental instability. It's not just PTSD from war that makes people susceptible to these things. Like, if you're down, if you're desperate, and you're desperate for community, if an extremist organization finds you before a legit organization or an organization that's out there for good, they can use your economic, your social, your mental instability as the hook to start reeling you in.
So if there's really no solid data that backs up the idea that veterans are more likely to join extremist groups than anyone in the general population, that they're not more susceptible, why worry about veterans in particular?
Yeah, so what we learned from the seemingly very high percentage of veterans who were arrested in the first weeks following the riot on January 6th is that the veterans, were central in command, control, and execution.
They were the leaders.
Correct. And that is why these extremist organizations recruit them, because the leaders are key. So veterans are important because when they do something, people follow them.
I want to ask you about how your approach to understanding domestic extremism has evolved since those initial forays into the world of the Patriot Front. You've made tracking extremists into a career, a business. You spend a lot of time trying to get information about the people in these groups. You call yourself a Nazi hunter. What are you hoping your work achieves? What is its goal?
So every time that a story about my work, whether it's infiltrating a neo-Nazi organization or releasing information about an unlawful militia planning an assault on the Capitol, I have had veterans reach out to me and basically say, like, how can I help? And, for the longest time, I had to just kind of ignore those calls. I'm not going to tell people to do what I do and join a neo-Nazi organization to sabotage them from within. Like that is, I recognize that that's crazy. But I have since figured out that I can give those veterans who want to do the same service to protect our country from threats within, give them an opportunity to do it. That's why I created my nonprofit, where I train veterans to study extremist movements, to track individual extremists, to gather evidence, and to treat that evidence in a way that it could be used to prosecute someone or to support a case against an extremist if they've done harm to someone. I'm still waiting for the FBI to ever arrest anyone that I, provide information on, but I'm hoping that someday law enforcement starts prosecuting these folks before they reach the point of actually committing violence. I'm not getting vets to, strap on body armor and carry weapons and go face these extremists in the streets. I believe that, we can gather evidence and hold them accountable in court. Or if not, at least expose them to the public so that their local communities understand that they've got a neo-Nazi, participating in their local economy.
You've spent a lot of time in your career advocating on the behalf of veterans. Do you think there has been a deep reputational damage to the image of veterans in the United States because of their association with extremist groups? I mean, what do you make of the fact that many of these groups see veterans as on their side?
Yeah, I do. I think that veterans have taken a hit in our reputation among Americans. And, frankly, it's deserved for what a bunch of veterans have done. It is it's my opinion that veterans have to work to earn the respect that we've been given. Vietnam vets did a lot of good for my generation in helping Americans understand the sacrifices that we make, even if we lose a war. But not everyone who has served our country is a good, decent, honorable person. Some are like Joe Biggs, a veteran who, represented the Proud Boys as he organized a violent insurrection, and Jessica Watkins and Stuart Rhodes of the Oath Keepers, veterans, who attempted to destroy the same Constitution that they swore an oath to. And it's okay for Americans to recognize that. Americans don't have to worship veterans. It hasn't always been part of our social fabric. And I think that the work that I'm doing will hopefully repair some of this damaged reputation. Some of us really, truly do care about America's promise and America's diversity, and recognizing that equality and inclusion may not have always been part of America, but they need to be, and we're willing to fight for it.
First Person is a production of New York Times Opinion. This episode was produced by Olivia Natt, with help from Derek Arthur. It was edited by Stephanie Joyce and Kari Pitkin. Mixing by Carol Saburo. Original music by Isaac Jones, Pat McCusker, and Carol Saburo. Fact-checking by Mary Marge Locker and Kate Sinclair. The rest of the First Person team includes Annabelle Bacon, Jillian Weinberger, Wyatt Orm, and Sophia Alvarez-Boyd. Special thanks to Christina Samuelewski, Shannon Busta, Allison Benedict, Annie Rose Strasser, and Katie Kingsbury.